Amara Johnson sat at her desk, reviewing case files late into the evening. The office had emptied hours ago, but she barely noticed. As the newest prosecutor in the Atlanta District Attorney's office, Amara knew she had to work twice as hard as everyone else. Not just because she was new, but because she was a black woman in a field that didn't expect her to succeed. The daughter of Jamaican immigrants, Amara had grown up watching her parents push through countless barriers. Her father worked double shifts as a nurse while her mother taught high school math. They had sacrificed everything to give Amara opportunities they never had. "Education is the one thing no one can take from you," her mother always said. Amara took those words to heart. She graduated at the top of her high school class, earned a full scholarship to Yale, and then fought her way into Harvard Law School. Every step of the way, she faced people who doubted her abilities. "Are you sure you're in the right classroom?" a professor had asked on her first day at Harvard. When she confirmed she was, he raised his eyebrows and said, "Well, this is going to be challenging material." Amara just smiled politely and took her seat. By the end of the semester, she had the highest grade in his class. Now, at 29 years old, Amara was building a reputation as a brilliant legal mind with an exceptional memory for statutes and case law. Her colleagues were starting to notice her talent, though some still made comments about diversity hires when they thought she couldn't hear. District Attorney Michael Collins knocked on her open door, interrupting her thoughts. "Still here, Johnson. It's almost 10 p.m. Amara looked up with a tired smile, just trying to get ahead on the Baker case. Collins nodded approvingly. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. I'm taking you off Baker." Amara's heart sank. Had she done something wrong? Was she being sidelined? Seeing her expression, Collins quickly added, "Because I need you on something bigger. The Reynolds fraud case just landed on my desk. It's high profile. The press will be watching." Amara's eyes widened. James Reynolds was a powerful businessman with connections to half the politicians in Georgia. His investment firm was accused of defrauding clients of millions. "You want me as lead prosecutor?" Amara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're the sharpest legal mind we have, and you know financial regulations better than anyone. Before you joined us, you helped draft some of those laws with the Senate Banking Committee, right?" Amara nodded. After law school, she'd spent 2 years in Washington working on financial reform legislation before deciding she wanted to be in the courtroom. "Perfect," Collins said. "Reynolds has hired Charles Whitmore to defend him." Amara felt her stomach tighten. Charles Whitmore was infamous in legal circles, a ruthless defense attorney who had never lost a white-collar case. He was also known for his old-school attitudes and barely hidden biases against women and minorities in the legal profession. "Whitmore will try to intimidate you," Collins warned. "He'll use every trick in the book." "I'll be ready," Amara said firmly. Collins smiled. "I know you will. The arraignment is next week. Case files will be on your desk tomorrow. Get some rest. You're going to need it." After Collins left, Amara sat back in her chair. This case could make or break her career. She thought of all the people who had doubted her, all the obstacles she had overcome. "Bring it on, Whitmore," she whispered to herself as she packed up her things. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The morning of the arraignment arrived, and Amara woke before her alarm. She had spent the past week learning everything about James Reynolds and his investment scheme. The businessman had tricked over 200 people into investing their life savings in projects that didn't exist. Many victims were elderly people who had lost everything. Amara dressed carefully in her best navy suit. She knew appearances mattered in court, especially today. As she fixed her hair, she thought about facing Charles Whitmore. His reputation was legendary: 30 years of practice, connections with every judge in the state, and a record of winning seemingly impossible cases. "First impressions matter," Amara said to her reflection. She grabbed her briefcase, filled with meticulously organized notes, and headed to the courthouse. The hallway outside courtroom 3 was packed with reporters and cameras. When Amara walked through the doors, many eyes turned to look at her. Some seemed surprised to see a young black woman as the lead prosecutor on such a high-profile case. "Ms. Johnson, is it true Reynolds stole over $10 million? A reporter called out. "The evidence will speak for itself," Amara replied professionally, moving past the crowd. At the prosecution table, she arranged her files and checked her watch. 10 minutes until the arraignment began. The defense table across the aisle remained empty. At exactly 8:59 a.m., the doors swung open dramatically. Charles Whitmore entered, surrounded by 3 junior attorneys carrying his files. Whitmore stood well over 6 feet tall, with silver hair and an expensive tailored suit. He looked like a man used to winning. Whitmore glanced at Amara and frowned slightly, as if disappointed. He leaned toward one of his associates and whispered something that made the younger man smirk. Amara pretended not to notice, but her grip on her pen tightened. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Wilson," the bailiff announced. Judge Wilson was a serious woman in her 60s with a reputation for running a strict courtroom. She nodded at both attorneys before taking her seat. Case number 2024 CR 789, State v. James Reynolds, the clerk announced. Reynolds, a man in his 50s with an artificial tan and perfect teeth, stood beside Whitmore. He looked more annoyed than worried. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Wilson asked. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Whitmore replied in his deep, confident voice. "Ms. Johnson, will the state be seeking pretrial detention?" the judge asked. Amara stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Reynolds presents a significant flight risk. He has homes in 5 countries, 3 of which have no extradition treaties with the United States. Additionally, we have evidence he recently transferred large sums to offshore accounts." Before she could continue, Whitmore interrupted. "Your Honor, my client is a respected businessman with deep roots in this community. The idea that he would flee is absurd." Judge Wilson frowned at the interruption. "Mr. Whitmore, please wait your turn." Amara continued. "Furthermore, the seriousness of these charges, 27 counts of fraud involving over $12 million, warrants detention." When she finished, Whitmore stood and buttoned his jacket. "Your Honor, the prosecution's request is excessive. Mr. Reynolds has no criminal record and has cooperated fully with authorities. We request release on his own recognizance." "Denied," Judge Wilson said firmly. "Bail is set at $5 million. The defendant will surrender his passport." Whitmore's face tightened with anger. He wasn't used to losing, even on small matters like bail. As the court adjourned, Whitmore approached Amara. "Ms. Johnson, is it? I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Amara replied calmly. "Well, you're certainly enthusiastic," he said with a condescending smile. "But this case is far more complex than it appears. Perhaps we should discuss a plea deal before you get in over your head." Amara met his gaze directly. "Mr. Whitmore, I've studied every detail of this case. I know exactly what Mr. Reynolds did, and I intend to prove it. But if your client wants to plead guilty to all charges, I'm open to that conversation." Whitmore's smile vanished. Without another word, he turned and walked away, but Amara noticed something in his eyes she hadn't expected: uncertainty. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur for Amara. Each day, she arrived at the office before dawn and left long after sunset. Her desk disappeared under mountains of financial records, witness statements, and legal precedents. This case would be her biggest challenge yet, but she was ready. District Attorney Collins stopped by her office on Friday afternoon. "How's it going?" "I found something interesting," Amara said, holding up a stack of papers. "Reynolds used a specific loophole in the reporting requirements to hide millions. I think this is how we nail him." Collins nodded approvingly. "Good work. But I should warn you, Whitmore filed a motion to dismiss this morning. Hearing is set for Monday." Amara wasn't surprised. Standard defense tactic. "Don't worry, I'll be ready." After Collins left, Amara's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Jasmine, her best friend since college. "Please tell me you're not working all weekend again," Jasmine said when Amara answered. "I have to prepare for a hearing on Monday." Jasmine sighed loudly. "Amara, you need a break. One night off won't ruin your case. My cousin is in town, and he's cute, single, and a doctor." "A setup?" "Seriously," Amara laughed. "Just dinner. Come on, when was the last time you did anything fun?" Amara looked at the files covering her desk. Maybe her friend was right. One evening off might help clear her head. "Fine," she agreed reluctantly. "But just dinner." Saturday evening was surprisingly pleasant. Jasmine's cousin Michael was smart and funny. and for a few hours, Amara almost forgot about the case. Almost. Sunday morning, she was back at her desk, reviewing every detail of Reynolds' financial dealings. By evening, she had prepared a solid response to Whitmore's motion to dismiss. Monday arrived with dark clouds that matched the mood in the courtroom. Charles Whitmore sat at the defense table, looking confident as always. When Amara entered, he gave her a small, dismissive nod. Judge Wilson called the court to order. "We're here for the defense's motion to dismiss. Mr. Whitmore, proceed." Whitmore stood smoothly, buttoning his expensive jacket. "Your Honor, the state's case against my client should be dismissed immediately for 3 key reasons." His deep voice filled the courtroom as he began his arguments, pacing confidently. First, the prosecution has failed to establish proper jurisdiction. Second, the alleged actions, even if proven, do not constitute fraud under state law. And third, the statute of limitations has expired on several counts. Whitmore continued for nearly 40 minutes, citing cases and legal principles with theatrical flair. Several times, he glanced at Amara with a small smirk, as if expecting her to be overwhelmed by his legal knowledge. Finally, he addressed his main argument. "Most importantly, Your Honor, the prosecution has charged my client under Section 33.4 of the Financial Fraud Act. However, this section applies only to securities trading, not private investment vehicles like my client's business." He paused dramatically. This fundamental misunderstanding of the law shows the prosecution's case is built on a completely flawed foundation. Whitmore returned to his seat, looking satisfied. Reynolds patted his lawyer's shoulder approvingly. "Ms. Johnson?" Judge Wilson said. "Your response." Amara rose calmly, carrying only a single notepad. Unlike Whitmore, she didn't pace or gesture dramatically. "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore's arguments sound impressive, but fall apart under scrutiny." She methodically addressed each point, her voice steady and clear. When she reached his main argument about jurisdiction, she paused. "As for Section 33.4, Mr. Whitmore's interpretation is incorrect. The legislative history clearly shows this section was specifically drafted to include private investment vehicles like Mr. Reynolds' operation." Whitmore frowned slightly, surprised by her confident rebuttal. He hadn't expected such a thorough response from someone so young. As Amara concluded her arguments, she noticed the judge nodding slightly. A good sign. "The motion to dismiss is denied," Judge Wilson announced. "This case will proceed to trial. We'll set the schedule now." While the clerk recorded the dates, Whitmore leaned toward his client. "Don't worry," he whispered, but loud enough for Amara to hear. "She just got lucky this time. When the trial starts, we'll show everyone what happens when people get jobs they're not qualified for." Amara pretended not to hear as she packed her notes. The real battle was just beginning. 2 months after the motion hearing, the trial of James Reynolds finally began. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras. Inside, the hallways buzzed with excitement about the high-profile case. Amara arrived early, carrying 2 boxes of evidence. She had prepared meticulously, rehearsing her opening statement dozens of times. Today would set the tone for the entire trial. As she arranged her materials at the prosecution table, she noticed Reynolds and Whitmore entering with their team of 5 attorneys. Reynolds wore an expensive suit and a confident smile, waving to someone in the gallery as if he were at a social event rather than his own trial. Whitmore stopped to chat with the court reporter, laughing loudly at something she said. Amara knew his friendliness was strategic. Building rapport with everyone in the courtroom was part of his famous technique. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Wilson entered. After the jury was seated, 7 women and 5 men from diverse backgrounds. The judge nodded to Amara. "The prosecution may present its opening statement." Amara stood and walked to the center of the courtroom. She made eye contact with each juror before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about trust and betrayal. James Reynolds presented himself as a financial expert who would help ordinary people grow their savings. 217 people trusted him with their money, their retirement funds, college savings for their children, even money saved for medical treatments." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The evidence will show that Mr. Reynolds never invested a single dollar of their money. Instead, he used it to buy vacation homes, luxury cars, and a private jet. When clients asked about their investments, he created fake account statements showing amazing returns. For 20 minutes, Amara outlined the case clearly and powerfully. Several jurors nodded as she explained how the scheme worked. When she finished, she returned to her seat, feeling confident. Whitmore stood for his opening statement, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Ladies and gentlemen, what Ms. Johnson just described sounds terrible. If it were true, I'd be outraged too." He smiled warmly at the jury. "But it's not true. The prosecution has misunderstood how high-level investments work." He spoke for nearly an hour, using complicated financial terms and suggesting the whole case was based on the prosecution's ignorance of sophisticated investment strategies. Throughout his speech, he referred to Amara as the young prosecutor or Ms. Johnson, with her limited experience. When opening statements concluded, Amara called her first witness, Barbara Wilson, a 72-year-old retired teacher who had lost her entire life savings to Reynolds. "Mrs. Wilson, how much money did you invest with the defendant?" Amara asked. $342,000, Mrs. Wilson replied, her voice shaking slightly. "My husband and I saved that money over 40 years of teaching." "And what did Mr. Reynolds tell you about this investment?" "He said it was completely safe. He guaranteed at least 8% returns each year, with no risk of losing our principal investment." Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears. "He knew that money was all we had for retirement." Amara guided Mrs. Wilson through her testimony carefully, establishing how Reynolds had earned her trust and then betrayed it. The jury watched intently, several looking sympathetically at the elderly witness. When Amara finished, she said, "Your witness, Mr. Whitmore." Whitmore approached Mrs. Wilson with a concerned expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm very sorry about your situation." His voice was gentle, but Amara recognized the strategy. He would start kindly before attacking the witness's credibility. "Thank you," Mrs. Wilson said cautiously. "Now, Mrs. Wilson, did you read the investment agreement before signing it?" Whitmore asked. "Well, it was very long and had a lot of legal language." "So that's a no." Whitmore interrupted, his tone suddenly sharper. "Objection." Amara stood. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Judge Wilson said firmly. "Mr. Whitmore, please allow the witness to finish her answers." Whitmore nodded respectfully to the judge but gave Amara an irritated glance. The message was clear, her objection had annoyed him. Amara didn't care. She would protect her witnesses from his aggressive tactics, no matter how much it upset him. As the day ended, Amara knew the real battle was just beginning. The trial entered its second week. Each day, Amara called more victims to testify, showing the jury the human cost of Reynolds' fraud. She also presented financial experts who explained how Reynolds had moved money between accounts to hide his scheme. By Wednesday morning, the courtroom had a tense atmosphere. Reynolds no longer smiled confidently. Instead, he whispered urgently to Whitmore during breaks, his face showing worry for the first time. Amara arrived early as usual and found a note on the prosecution table. It read, "Consider a plea deal before you embarrass yourself further." She crumpled it without reaction, knowing it came from Whitmore's team. "The prosecution calls Robert Chen," Amara announced when court began. Mr. Chen, a forensic accountant from the FBI, took the stand. He was Amara's key expert witness, ready to explain the complicated money trail Reynolds had created. "Mr. Chen, can you tell the jury what these bank records show?" Amara asked, displaying documents on the courtroom screen. "These records show that Mr. Reynolds transferred $4.3 million from client accounts to an offshore company he controlled in the Cayman Islands," Chen explained. From there, the money was used to purchase his vacation home in Aspen. Chen's testimony continued for hours as he methodically traced how Reynolds had stolen from his clients. The evidence was damning. Several jurors took detailed notes, and one even gasped when Chen revealed the total amount stolen, $12.7 million. When Amara finished her questions, she noticed Whitmore looking less confident than usual. "Your witness, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Whitmore approached the stand slowly. "Mr. Chen, is it possible that these transfers were legitimate business expenses?" "No," Chen replied firmly. These were client funds specifically designated for investment, not operational expenses. Whitmore tried several more angles, but Chen's answers remained clear and convincing. Frustrated, Whitmore suddenly changed tactics. "Mr. Chen, isn't it true that your analysis relies heavily on Section 47.3 of the Financial Fraud Accountability Act?" Whitmore asked. "Yes, that's correct," Chen confirmed. Whitmore smiled, looking pleased with himself. "And you're aware that Section 47.3 specifically excludes certain types of private investment funds from these reporting requirements?" Chen hesitated. "I'm not an attorney, so I can't speak to the specific legal interpretations." Whitmore turned to Judge Wilson. "Your Honor, I move to strike Mr. Chen's entire testimony. His analysis is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Section 47.3. The judge looked at Amara. "Ms. Johnson?" "May we approach the bench, Your Honor?" Amara requested. At the bench, Whitmore spoke before Amara could begin. "Your Honor, Section 47.3 clearly states that reporting requirements apply only to registered securities and not to private investment vehicles with fewer than 500 individual investors. My client's fund falls into the latter category." He turned to Amara with a condescending smile. "Perhaps Ms. Johnson should review the statute more carefully before building her entire case on it." Judge Wilson looked at Amara. "Ms. Johnson?" "Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore is misinterpreting the statute," Amara replied calmly. "The exclusion he cites only applies if the fund manager properly registers with the Securities Exchange Commission and provides quarterly reports to investors, neither of which Mr. Reynolds did." Whitmore shook his head and actually laughed. "With all due respect, that interpretation completely contradicts the legislative intent. The purpose of Section 47.3 was to reduce regulatory burden on small investment funds, not increase it." He looked at Amara with barely disguised contempt. Anyone familiar with the history of this legislation would know that. Amara remained perfectly composed. "Your Honor, may I respond to Mr. Whitmore's point about legislative intent?" The judge nodded. "Proceed." "The legislative history directly contradicts Mr. Whitmore's claim," Amara said. "The congressional record clearly shows that Section 47.3 was specifically designed to close the loophole that allowed fund managers to avoid oversight by claiming private investment status." Whitmore interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your Honor, I've been practicing securities law for 30 years. I think I understand the intent of." "Let Ms. Johnson finish," Judge Wilson said firmly. Amara nodded appreciatively to the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor. The court should be aware that Mr. Whitmore's interpretation not only contradicts the plain language of the statute, but also ignores key amendments made in 2018. Whitmore was becoming visibly frustrated. This young prosecutor was not backing down as he had expected. Little did he know, Amara's most powerful point was still to come. The tension at the judge's bench was thick enough to cut with a knife. Whitmore stood with his arms crossed, a smug smile on his face as he waited for Judge Wilson to side with his interpretation of Section 47.3. Reynolds watched anxiously from the defense table, while the jury looked confused by the sudden legal argument. "Your Honor," Whitmore continued, his voice loud enough for the jury to hear, "I have the actual text of Section 47.3 right here." He held up a document with highlighted sections. "Perhaps we should all review it together, for the benefit of everyone." He glanced at Amara with barely concealed contempt. Judge Wilson frowned at his tone but nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Whitmore." Whitmore cleared his throat dramatically. Section 47.3, subsection B, states, "Private investment vehicles managing funds for fewer than 500 individual investors are exempt from daily reporting requirements outlined in subsection A, provided quarterly summaries are furnished to all stakeholders." He looked up triumphantly. "My client had only 217 investors, well below the 500 threshold. This entire case is built on a misreading of the law." Several reporters in the courtroom gallery scribbled notes furiously. This could be a major turning point in the trial. "I believe Ms. Johnson is simply unfamiliar with the nuances of securities law," Whitmore added, not bothering to hide his condescension. He actually chuckled as he turned to Amara. It's a complex field that typically requires years of specialized experience. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for Amara's response. She remained perfectly calm, her expression unchanged by Whitmore's insulting tone. "Your Honor," Amara began, her voice steady. Mr. Whitmore is selectively quoting from Section 47.3. If he had continued reading to subsection C, he would have found the following text. However, exemption under subsection B applies only if the investment vehicle has registered properly with the Securities and Exchange Commission under Form PF 103 and has disclosed all beneficial owners. She paused briefly. Mr. Reynolds never filed Form PF 103, as established by the SEC records already entered into evidence as Exhibit 27. Whitmore's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Your Honor, subsection C was added in the 2018 amendment, but it's widely understood within the legal community that this amendment was intended to apply only to new investment vehicles, not existing ones like my client's fund, which was established in 2015. He laughed again, looking at his junior attorneys as if sharing a private joke. This is precisely why these cases should be handled by attorneys with specialized knowledge in securities law. Judge Wilson turned to Amara. "Ms. Johnson, do you have a response to Mr. Whitmore's point about the 2018 amendment?" The courtroom went completely silent. Even Reynolds leaned forward in his seat, sensing that this moment could determine his fate. Amara took a deep breath. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She stood a little straighter. The 2018 amendment's application to existing investment vehicles is actually explicitly addressed in the legislative history. Whitmore sighed loudly, making a show of his impatience. In fact, Amara continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. The congressional record includes specific language stating that the amendment was designed to close a loophole that existing funds were exploiting. This is clearly stated in the Senate Banking Committee report dated March 12, 2018. "And how would you know what's in that report?" Whitmore interrupted, his tone dismissive. Amara looked directly at him for the first time. "I know what's in that report, Mr. Whitmore, because I wrote it." The courtroom went completely still. "I beg your pardon?" Whitmore's confident expression faltered. "Before joining the district attorney's office, I served as legal counsel to the Senate Banking Committee from 2017 to 2019, Amara explained calmly. "I was the primary drafter of the 2018 amendments to Section 47.3, including subsection C, which was specifically written to apply to all investment vehicles, regardless of when they were established." Judge Wilson looked at Amara with new respect. "Is this correct, Ms. Johnson?" "Yes, Your Honor. I can provide documentation confirming my role, if the court requires it." Whitmore stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The color had drained from his face. Behind him, Reynolds sank lower in his chair. A stunned silence filled courtroom 3A. For several seconds, not a single person moved or spoke. Whitmore stood frozen at the bench, his confident smile completely gone. Judge Wilson looked from Amara to Whitmore, her expression a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. In the gallery, reporters frantically typed on their phones, eager to break the news of this dramatic courtroom moment. One sketch artist quickly captured Whitmore's shocked face, a drawing that would appear on the evening news across the country. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Wilson finally said, breaking the silence, "do you have documentation of your role with the Senate Banking Committee?" "Yes, Your Honor," Amara replied, reaching into her briefcase. She handed a folder to the judge. "This includes my appointment letter, committee assignments, and drafting credits for the 2018 amendments." Judge Wilson reviewed the documents carefully while Whitmore remained silent, still processing what had just happened. His entire strategy had collapsed in seconds. "The court confirms Ms. Johnson's previous position," Judge Wilson announced, looking up from the papers. "Mr. Whitmore, your objection is overruled. Mr. Chen's testimony will stand, and your motion to strike is denied." As they returned to their tables, Whitmore stumbled slightly, something no one had ever seen him do in court. His junior attorneys looked at each other with wide eyes, unsure how to react to their boss's humiliation. "That was unexpected," one whispered. Reynolds grabbed Whitmore's arm as he sat down. "What just happened?" he hissed. You said this was going to work. Whitmore shook off Reynolds' hand, his face now flushed with anger and embarrassment. Shut up, he muttered through clenched teeth. On the other side of the courtroom, Amara calmly arranged her notes, showing no reaction to the dramatic moment. Inside, however, her heart raced. She had prepared for this moment, knowing Whitmore would eventually try to use Section 47.3 as a defense. But seeing his reaction, the shock, the disbelief that she could possibly know more than him, was more satisfying than she had imagined. The prosecution may continue with the witness, Judge Wilson instructed. Amara stood. No further questions for Mr. Chen, Your Honor. The prosecution rests. Judge Wilson raised her eyebrows, surprised that Amara would end her case right after such a powerful moment. It was a confident move, showing she believed the evidence already presented was enough to convict. Very well. Court will recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. when the defense will present its case. As soon as the judge left the courtroom, reporters rushed toward Amara, shouting questions. Security officers quickly stepped in, creating a path for her to exit. In the hallway, District Attorney Collins waited with a broad smile. That was something else, he said as they walked toward the elevator. You never told me you wrote that amendment. It never came up, Amara replied simply. Well, it's going viral already. Someone in the gallery recorded the whole exchange on their phone. Collins showed her his screen, where a video was already collecting thousands of views. The video had captured everything. Whitmore's condescending laugh, his dismissive tone, and then his face as Amara revealed her role in writing the very law he had tried to use against her. I don't care about going viral, Amara said quietly. I just want justice for the victims. Back in the courtroom, Whitmore and his team huddled in urgent discussion. Their planned defense strategy was now useless. One junior attorney suggested a plea deal, but Whitmore slammed his fist on the table. We are not approaching her for a deal, he snapped. We'll find another way. Reynolds leaned in. Charles, be realistic. You said we had a solid case, but that woman just destroyed you in front of everyone. My reputation is ruined, and I'm looking at serious prison time. We need to cut a deal while we still can. Whitmore glared at his client. For the first time in his 30-year career, he had no clever response, no backup plan. The great Charles Whitmore had finally met his match, and her name was Amara Johnson. The next morning, Amara arrived at the courthouse to find a crowd of reporters waiting. News of yesterday's dramatic courtroom moment had spread everywhere. Her phone had been buzzing all night with messages from friends, former classmates, and even her old colleagues from the Senate Banking Committee. Ms. Johnson, how does it feel to be a viral sensation? One reporter called out. Amara smiled politely but kept walking. I'm just focused on the case, she replied. Inside, she noticed something different. The court officers nodded respectfully as she passed. The clerk, who had previously been friendly with Whitmore, but distant with her, greeted her warmly. Something had shifted in how people saw her. As she arranged her materials at the prosecution table, Amara noticed the defense table remained empty. The clock showed 8:55 a.m., unusual for Whitmore, who typically arrived early to prepare. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Wilson entered. All rise, the bailiff announced. Still, no sign of Whitmore or Reynolds. Counsel for the defense appears to be running late, Judge Wilson noted, checking her watch with a frown. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened. Whitmore entered alone, without his team of junior attorneys or his client. His usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his tie crooked, his hair not perfectly combed. Mr. Whitmore, where is your client? Judge Wilson asked. Your Honor, may I approach the bench? Whitmore requested, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Judge Wilson nodded, and Amara joined them at the bench. Your Honor, Whitmore began quietly, my client wishes to change his plea. Amara kept her expression neutral, though inside she felt a surge of satisfaction. I see, Judge Wilson said. And where is Mr. Reynolds now? He's in the conference room with his new attorney, Whitmore replied, avoiding eye contact with Amara. I am withdrawing from the case, effective immediately. This was unexpected. Whitmore never abandoned cases, even when things looked bad. May I ask why? The judge inquired. Whitmore hesitated. We have. irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy. Judge Wilson looked skeptical but nodded. Very well. We'll take a 30-minute recess for Mr. Reynolds to appear with his new counsel. As they returned to their tables, Whitmore paused beside Amara. For a moment, she thought he might apologize for his condescending behavior. Instead, he simply said, "Good job, counselor," and walked away. It wasn't an apology, but from Charles Whitmore, it was as close as anyone ever got. When court resumed, Reynolds appeared with a new attorney, Patricia Mendez, a well-respected defense lawyer known for her integrity. "Your Honor, my client wishes to change his plea to guilty on all counts," Mendez announced. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Reynolds, the man who had claimed complete innocence for months, now stood with his head bowed as the judge asked if he understood the consequences of his plea. "Yes, Your Honor," he said quietly. Judge Wilson set a date for sentencing and dismissed the court. As people began filing out, Barbara Wilson, the retired teacher who had lost her savings, approached Amara. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "Not just for getting our money back, but for standing up to that man. The way he talked to you, the way he laughed." She shook her head. "It reminded me of how people treated me when I started teaching in the 1970s. Some things haven't changed enough." "Some things haven't," Amara agreed. "But some things have." 3 weeks later, Reynolds was sentenced to 12 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to all his victims. The case made Amara something of a celebrity in legal circles. Law schools invited her to speak, and young attorneys, especially women of color, reached out to her for mentorship. As for Whitmore, the viral video of his courtroom humiliation had lasting consequences. Several clients dropped him, and his firm asked him to take a leave of absence. Eventually, he announced his early retirement. 6 months after the trial, Amara received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a newspaper clipping about her appointment to head a new financial crimes task force and a short note: "Lesson learned, respect earned. Sit au." She smiled and pinned the note to her bulletin board, a small reminder that sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways.